Hello, my name is Olivia Gray, and I am a graduate research assistant at Borderlands Research Institute at Sul Ross State University. My thesis is studying the potential avenues of competition between desert bighorn sheep, aoudad, and mule deer. To give some background history in desert bighorn sheep in Texas, in the mid-1940s, desert bighorn started to disappear. Fortunately, in 1954, Texas Parks and Wildlife began restoration efforts. Unfortunately, in the early 1960s, the native population was completely extirpated from Texas. But with the restoration efforts that began in 1954 from Texas Parks and Wildlife, our current total estimation from 2015 to 2017 is around 1,500. Around the same time that bighorn were extirpated from Texas, non-native aoudad were introduced into this region. This happened in 1957 in Palo Duro Canyon up in the Panhandle when 31 aoudad were released. Aoudad are originally from Africa and were brought over to the United States to be placed in zoos as well as for commercial hunting. They are a generalist species, meaning that they eat browse, grass, and forbs and adapt to areas very well, which they have adapted to the Trans-Pecos area extremely well. They can reproduce up to 2 times per year and have up to 2 babies per gestation period. You can see this through the growth rate from 1957 with just 31 aoudad in Texas to the almost 20,000 aoudad by 1999. This number is continuing to grow. My first chapter, I'm going to be looking at the potential dietary overlap between desert bighorn sheep, mule deer, and aoudad. My main overarching question within this chapter is, what are the dynamics of dietary overlap through time? My first main objective is to determine to genus or species level the diets of mule deer, desert bighorn sheep, and aoudad populations through 1 year of sampling. My second objective is to investigate temporal patterns in the dietary overlap between the 3 species. One thing that we have to consider within this question is that nothing is stationary. Seasons are the one things that we can expect to change throughout the year. Within the changing seasons, there will be different precipitation rates, weather that affects temperatures, and differences in vegetation. The season with the highest precipitation rate in this region of Texas is during the summer monsoon season. So within this high rainfall, we would expect there to be more vegetation biomass just based on the higher amount of rainfall. So we can expect there to be a lower rate of competition between these 3 ungulate species during this time period, just based on the fact that there is a lot of vegetation for them to consume. Whereas we would expect the opposite within the winter months, when most of the vegetation is dormant and they have a very small amount to choose from within their choices of vegetation, meaning that we would expect there to be a higher competition within resource use, specifically in vegetation, through the winter months. Another system that is constantly changing is animals' behavior. Within each behavior, they are using different amounts of resources. Some examples of this include gestation periods and lactation periods within females. They are consuming a higher amount of vegetation in order to provide the nutrients that they need and the energy that they need to grow a fetus inside of them, and also to provide the amount of nutrients that they need for lactation. The main point with all this is everything is cyclical. Everything is working together, and we need to make sure that we take all of these things into account when looking at the dietary overlap or potential competition within all 3 of these ungulate species. With this project comes a lot of field sampling. Luckily, to make this easier on us, we have collars on all 3 species out on this property. So in order to find these animals using these collars, we use something called radiotelemetry, which you can see in the upper left-hand corner. This sends us an audible signal of where these animals are, so we are able to locate them, glass them, watch them for a little bit, making sure that they are foraging and that they defecate before we hike all the way up there to collect their fecal samples. Another thing that we're collecting in the field is vegetation. I want to make sure that I get a very good representation of every single possible plant that they could be consuming. Therefore, I am collecting every single plant on this property in order for us to have a good reference material for our lab analysis. Once we take these samples back to the lab, we are using a process called microhistology. What microhistology is we take all of the plant and the fecal samples and we dry them in a dryer. Once they are completely dry, we grind them up. Once the samples are dried and ground, we can then put them on a microscope in order to see their cell structure. The reason that we're doing this is to provide reference materials for plants. We will do the exact same thing with the fecal samples, and we will be able to find different plant cells in these fecal samples. A good example of this is in this picture you will see evergreen sumac. We dried and ground this sample and we were able to see the cell structure. So if we were to look at a fecal sample and see this exact cell structure, we would know that that animal is eating evergreen sumac. Something else that we're working on is looking at if there is a visual difference between the samples. Currently, we don't have any way of distinguishing if there is a difference between aoudad, bighorn, and mule deer. So right now we're looking at the color, density, length, width, hardness, or any other distinguishing characteristics between bighorn, mule deer, and aoudad fecal samples. This will hopefully make my project a little bit easier, as I will be able to walk up to a pile and know for sure that that is a bighorn fecal pile or an aoudad or mule deer. My second chapter is looking at temporal resource partitioning. My main question that I'm asking within this is, when are animals using resources? Some of these resources can include water, vegetation, or shade. Another big question is, are they using these resources at the same time? Or are they using them more like a timeshare? So are mule deer partitioning their time at a water source with aoudad, or are they using them at the exact same time, which could lead to potential competition? How we're going to be doing this is using GPS data that we have over multiple years through the collar data. We will be finding trends through autocorrelation. Autocorrelation measures the relationship of observations between different points in time. And within that, we can look for patterns and trends over time series. The best way that I can explain this is, what do we do as humans? We have a schedule of when we get up, when we eat, and when we go to bed. We usually do these things around the same time every day, and there's a cycle in when we do these things. We would expect animals to have cycles as well in what they are doing. So we are looking at, in this example, waters. Are they going to water at the same time? And is there any cycle within the time that they're going to these waters? So if bighorn are going to waters at the same time every single day, we would expect their model to look like this, where we have peaks every 24 hours, showing that all of these are correlated and that they are at that same place every single day. So we can see a cycle. We actually ran this model on one desert bighorn, and we see that there's not really a cycle within this. Now, this is just preliminary data, and we are going to run this with every single collared individual out on the property, and we are going to put different resources into this model. So this is modeling water on one desert bighorn. What it kind of looks like is they are just foraging and getting water when they need to go get water, but there's really no pattern in when they are going to water sources. In summation, everything is a cycle. There is seasonal variation of vegetation, there's differences in behaviors within animals, and there's also possible ways that ungulates can partition their resources. Looking at the overlap in diet as well as the resource use will give us a good idea of how animals could partition their space to limit competition, or if there's any overlap in diet or in resource use when resources are limited. While I am still in the preliminary stages of my thesis, I am excited to share my results with y'all in the future. Thank you.